going to go ahead and get started. We're going to continue the chapter we started last week called Just Call Me Jacob and get that finished up for tonight. We're at the very beginning because last week I failed to turn on the power supply thingy and the camera died. So I'm going to back up just a hair on part of this, not very far, but kind of start out at a spot here that got cut off. We've been talking about, Jacob and Esau, and we've got to the point where Jacob ended up at Laban's, his uncle's house, and Jacob basically met his match in all of this. After Jacob pretended to be Esau and stole his father's blessing, he ended up living with Laban for 21 years, and he had no intention, I don't think, at the very beginning of living with him that long. But when he went to live with Laban started tricking him out of stuff. And the girl that Jacob fell in love with, he ended up not getting her at the first. He got her sister instead. Then he had to work 7 more years to get the other girl. And just by the time it was all said and done, he ended up being there for about 21 years. And what was so crazy about all of this is Jacob, up until this point, had spent his whole life doing the same thing that Laban did to him. He had been just tricking, different people out of things. His success that he had was based on the fact that he was dishonest, the fact that he was, not being truthful and upfront with people, and he was being very conniving behind their back and that kind of thing. And I know last week we talked a little bit about, you guys probably know some people in your life that maybe treat you that way. Maybe you guys have treated somebody else that way. I know that there's times in my life when I've not been where I should be, that I have done some things that I should not have to trick people into thinking certain things, or when I want to be, I can be pretty manipulative with the way that I talk to people. And my first marriage, when I was in it, my ex-wife and I, that was pretty much our whole 8 years that we were together. And we just constantly was doing things kind of behind each other's back, lots of lies and all that kind of thing. And, when you live a life like that for an extended period of time, it really kind of gets to a point where it gets difficult to start talking yourself out of the situations you get yourself into. And that's kind of the point to where we were getting, we had made the excuses and we had lied to each other as much as we possibly could, and, made up stories and all the typical stuff that happens sometimes in relationships that aren't where they should be. And, ultimately, we were just doomed from the beginning. And, that's what led to our divorce there towards the end of that. And we chose, we weren't where God wanted us to be to begin with. And I know that, I've kind of talked about this a little bit before in some of our other altered discussions that we've had. But that's kind of what happens when you get out of God's plan, I think. A lot of times, if we are not in His plan, and we know we're not in His plan, before we know it, we're just trying to excuse our way through things, or we're making up scenarios to try to appease other people. We say things that other people want to hear, although it may not really be the truth. I think you guys probably know where I'm going at with all that, because I'm sure all of us have been in those positions at least once or twice in our life. If you're anywhere bit human, that's just the human nature. But that's kind of where Jacob was at with all of this. He spent a lot of his life tricking people to get blessings, tricking people to get wealth and his fame and all that kind of thing. And he was basically the king of cons, and to an extent. But with Laban, Jacob had met his match. And, whenever we always try to manipulate other people, it just gets super difficult, complicated, confusing, exhausting. It just kind of becomes a weight on your shoulders. In Matthew 19:30, we talked last week, it said, Jesus once said something pretty powerful. He said, many who are first will be last, and many who are last will be first. In other words, it's not always the ones who get ahead who are ahead. And if you guys remember the movie Talladega Nights, everybody ever seen that movie?
No.
Imagine that being a good example for tonight's lesson. You remember what Ricky Bobby, what his dad said to him when he was, peeling out. He yelled at him, he said, if you ain't first, you're last. If you remember that. And Jesus might say, yeah, that's a decent movie, but that's the wrong philosophy. That's not how we're supposed to live. But isn't that what's kind of pushed into you a lot of times from being a child? Especially if you're in sports and, you maybe have some type of an athletic background in school. I've heard a lot of parents really push this into their kids, instilling them, if you're not first place, you've lost. You're either first place and you win, or you're a loser. I've seen so many parents do that to their kids, and that is too much pressure for children to live under as they grow up. And I think a lot of times too, I think that even if there's not sports involved, if there's just siblings, the way that some parents raise siblings together sometimes, I think they almost create an atmosphere of competition between all of the kids, and that ends up creating some huge problems.
It reminds me of a story. There was a devotion I did recently, and the guy was talking about how something his dad did that kind of shaped the way he went through life for a long time. And he used to play basketball, was like good at it. He'd score like 20 points a game, and the dad was all like super proud of him. And in one game, he only scored like 5, and his dad literally didn't say a word to him for like 3 days straight. Mm-hmm. And so like that screwed him up so bad that he went through life trying to do everything perfect or whatever, and try to be best at everything.
Yeah. And what's crazy about that is there is a balance, I think, that we have to try to achieve, because we don't want to be losers in life. I mean, we want to have some success and feel like we're actually serving a purpose while we're here. And we want to feel like that we're good at some things and maybe even an expert in some fields. It always makes us feel good to be the person that people come to when they need, certain help or certain questions answered or whatever. But there is a balance, though, that you have to take. You can't let that just consume you your whole life to where it just creates somebody in you that you're not.
I think we just have to try our best at whatever we do, and that's all we can
do. Yeah. Yep.
I was just thinking it's interesting what people think is the best, or what people compare their kids with, I guess. Because I was thinking the environment that I grew up in, it wasn't proper to do sports. So parents I grew up around, they didn't compare their kids' sports. They really didn't care all that much about their kids' grades. Mm-hmm. It was all about which Bible school they went to, and their pride and joy was however many or whatever their kids were doing churchy stuff. So if your kid was out preaching, and if he was a good preacher, that was the thing. If your daughter married a good preacher, somebody really spiritual looking, and it was like, well, all of that stuff is good, but you put so much pressure on it, you almost take away the value of what you're doing, and you talk about that so much, you kind of forgot that maybe your kid's going to be a pastor one day, and you need people who work non-pastor jobs to fill your pastor kid's church. It's just kind of interesting what people compare.
Yeah. And
you always end up lopsided either way.
And I feel like that, because I grew up in that too, and I feel like that I think most pastors that I've ever met that truly have an humble spirit don't feel like they're really all that good at what they do. Yeah. They get up there behind the pulpit because that's where God called them, and He called them to lead churches and all that kind of thing. And they know they're capable of it. They know that they do a good job of it or whatever. But if you truly ask them how they truly feel about what they do in life, they feel like they're not worthy of it. And I think those are the true people that have been called to that, because if you do have that pressure of your parents or whoever pushing you into those spots and trying to exalt you up to be the best that there is at whatever, and that pride starts getting in there, then I think you do fall out of step with what God's will is for your life at that point. And usually the people that get into ministry that way, they don't last. They'll get burned out. I think that's where your burnout starts coming in, because kind of like what we've been talking here, it's exhausting to try to stay ahead of everybody else and try to be the best. And especially if you're doing it under your own, burning your own oil, I think if God is leading you in all of that, and He is sustaining you and giving you the strength and giving you the wisdom and feeding you in the ministry that you're in, I think those type of people are the ones that are super successful at what they do, and they lead a lot of people to Christ. And that's one thing that Michelle and I've kind of struggled with our kids a little bit, because I'm going to admit, because I grew up in that type of a background, I did grow up as a pretty strict parent. I wasn't nothing like my parents were, but there was still a lot of just black and white with me in a lot of areas. And now I am seeing the results of that even in my own kids, because I've got a daughter that's she's in the ministry. She's getting her education at Christian colleges. She has the desire to go into ministry and all of that. I've got 2 boys that literally to my face have said that all I did was shove God down their throat the whole time that they grew up, and they don't know if it's really real, because I've been talking all these years about Jesus is coming back, and if you're not ready, you're going to be left here and you're going to go to hell and all this kind of thing. And of course, he's never came back yet. And I've heard all this stuff, and it disappoints me, really. It does. It upsets me, because I know where their soul's at. I know the truth, and I know what the Bible says. But at this point, Michelle and I know that it's not going to be us that's going to get our kids to change. It's going to take somebody from the outside, or it's going to take an experience in life that they're going to go through that's going to force them to try to search for the true meaning of what life really is all about. And that's what it's going to take to change them at this point. And Michelle and I talked a little bit about, it really terrifies us, because what if Jesus does come back tomorrow? Our kids aren't going to be ready to go now. And it's almost like they put the blame on our shoulders. And this whole time, we thought as parents we were doing the right thing. We kept them in church. We never let them make their own church choices till they were 18 years old, which I still think that's a good thing to do. There is a point in time when they got to make that decision on their own, but it's our responsibility to lead them in the way that God wants us to lead them, and we're held responsible for all of that. But there's a balance in that as well, and it just makes it difficult when you have that situation happen. But
I know in my experience, my mom had talked about, that traumatic experience or whatever, and my mom had talked about that one time, with me, 'cause my dad died. And so she was kind of the opposite way. She was kind of hoping that we wouldn't fall away, because that's kind of one of those things. And, I have had my own thoughts and discussions with God about it, but, it's one of those situations where you're like, why did he take him away so young?
mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of another situation where you can think about falling away and and usually if you're going to fall away, it's something like that. You have one of those traumatic experiences.
Yeah. Whenever Michelle's dad was murdered, it actually made a difference, made an impact on our kids. And there for a little bit, it almost seemed like they were kind of coming back the direction they needed to go, because I think it kind of brought life down to their level for once, and they realized that, hey, we're not here for a long time, and stuff does happen. But obviously God just didn't get a hold of them yet, and I'm hoping and praying that'll eventually turn around. In Luke 9:25, Jesus said, "What good is it for someone to gain the whole world and yet lose or forfeit their very self?" And when we look at Jacob, he's got this written here. In other words, you could say, what good is it, Jacob, if you grasp after stuff, status, success, security, only to find yourself more lost than ever? What good is it if in the process of grabbing and groping and grasping that you lose yourself and who you are? There's a Guns N' Roses song. Axl Rose had some lyrics in this song, and basically what he said is, just because you're winning doesn't mean that you're the lucky ones.
Yeah.
And considering who Axl Rose is, that's actually a little bit of wisdom coming from him. But a lot of people, though, they look at it that way. They gauge their success, they gauge their life levels and the relationships that they have around them and all that kind of thing. They gauge all of that on how successful they are with all of that stuff.
And with that too, you think about it, usually the more successful people are more of the lonely people. You think about all the money in Hollywood, which that's a different story, but in Hollywood and how successful they are and how many wives and girlfriends and boyfriends that they've been through. They're on their second and third, husbands or wives. And then on top of that too, you think about even like the Amazon guy, he just got divorced recently too, and it's like, just because you're successful doesn't mean you're happy.
Yeah. go ahead.
That's what I was just thinking about, because something that I've thought about a couple times in the last few weeks. So I just bought a house, and it's kind of tiny, all things considering, because it's not even 1,000 square foot. And
Small packages.
yeah, that's what I was getting to. I know a girl who is in the process of building a house, and it is probably 3 times the size of mine. It probably costs 3 times as much as mine. And she did a little to her on Instagram one day, and I'm just watching it. I'm like, this house is massive, and kind of made me a little bit sad because I know her friend circle. And she talked about, oh, this is my pantry where I'm going to keep all my crock pots for when we have people over. And I thought, how often are you going to have people over? Because I don't think she truly knows how to have a healthy friendship. Because anytime she talks to us about her friends, she'll tell us something good about them. And then the next day she'll be running them down whatever bad qualities she's talking about in that friend today. She doesn't actually know how to have healthy friendships. Mm-hmm. And I was like, you're going to have this massive house, and are you really going to have a happy community to fill it up? And I just feel lucky because I've had people in my house nonstop ever since I bought it. And like, people want to come here and there and like help with little things. And I'm like, I may not have a 3,000 square foot house, but I have a community. And so my little house is going to be stuffed to the seams with people.
Yeah. It'll be a lot more joyful environment, and it'll probably impact a lot more lives. And
hope so.
I've known a lot of people that's kind of that same scenario. We all have these dreams that sometimes, man, these people, they get all this stuff, and they go all these places, and it seems like they just have a never-ending money source. And it gets, especially when you work your rear off to make the income that you make, and then you get a second income because you get married, and your spouse is working their rear off, and yet you still see this one person out there that still just kind of blows you out of the water. And, that's the material things, the materialistic side of things, when we look at that and we start putting that stuff in front of everything else. And that stuff, like they always say, it's material, it never lasts. It does not fulfill those needs that we have to have, like what God can. And, I see people that are more happy in life that have a lot of money when they actually give a lot of what they have away. Because that's the way that God's design truly is with that. The more he blesses you with, he wants you to bless other people with that. A lot of people are terrified to give their stuff away because they're afraid they're not going to have it anymore. They don't have faith in God enough to believe that if they do give that away, he's going to refill and resustain that. Kind of like the lady with the empty oil vessel. When Elijah came to her and wanted her to make that bread for him, and she used everything that she had. A lot of people today, I think, probably would told him to go fly a kite. I don't think they would have made him any bread, because that's their oil and it's all they've got left. They don't have the faith that God's going to keep refilling that. I could probably be guilty of that a few times myself, because when we live the life that we live today, where we have so many things at our grasp, as long as we can afford it, it's kind of hard to have that servant type spirit sometimes, where we just want to pour into other people, even with our material things and our money and all that kind of thing, because we work so hard to obtain some of that stuff sometimes. But that's what God wants out of us, and that's the things that are truly blessed in the end. He was telling here in the book about, he went to a convention, and it kind of goes along with what we've been talking a little bit here. It was a convention of a whole bunch of pastors. It was just a big event that was going on, and a big dinner. And while they were sitting there talking amongst each other, the conversation came up. The discussion started talking about, this one person said, how would you describe your overall feelings about ministry at this point? And keep in mind that this is a bunch of seasoned pastors and new pastors. It was just a group of, just a good mixture of pastors in different walks of life. When they asked this guy asked this question, he said the mood of the room grew really gray. As each preacher weighed in, Stephen said he was shocked and a little saddened that the majority responded with some version of this conclusion: being in ministry is like being in prison. That's kind of how all their input kind of started sounding like. And Stephen said it wasn't until a few days after the event that he realized the impact that that exchange had on him, of him sitting there and listening to these well-known pastors talking about this. In his mind, he was thinking, these are good men at the top of their field. They help people. They have purpose. They're making a tremendous difference. And it's not that they're hypocrites. They wasn't really coming off in that sense, really. It just goes to show that all the success in the world, even when you're doing God's work, doesn't guarantee a satisfied soul. These men whose spiritual maturity many envy were silently miserable. And Stephen said he decided at that point that he didn't want to be a pastor like that. He didn't want to look at himself 10 years down the road compared to where he was at 10 years ago and realize that he was worse off now than he was back when he started. He decided that he wanted to approach that a little bit differently. And he said that if that's what it, the way that they were building their ministry, if that's the way that it took to have a big ministry, he didn't want it. He wanted to stay away from that. He said that he refused to give his life to helping others live in freedom and secretly feel as if he was locked in solitary confinement, is basically the way that he put it. He says, if you get what you want and then don't want what you've got, what's the point? There has to be a better way. Many of us never stop to consider our course, so we lose ourselves, the real us, the authentic us, the valuable us, because we are so desperate to claw our way to the top. And I think we probably know a lot of people that we might have known them since childhood. They used to be people that we could actually hang around and actually get along with. And as they've gotten older and they start getting success in their eyes and they start, being backstabbing and, doing different things to try to get to the very top, they become people you don't want to hang around anymore. They change into a different kind of person that we don't want to have association with. And that's a shame because, I've seen some really close friends before that's gotten divided and in essence lost their friendship because at one point in life, they both went two opposite directions. One person stayed humble and they stayed, down to earth and that kind of thing. The other one tried to claw their way to the top and stomping on people all the way there, not regardless of who they were. And it's not worth it whenever we lose the authentic person that God's created us to be just to try to be successful like that. So the scripture that I just read, Jesus is asking if we lose who we are just to gain money, popularity, church attendance, Instagram followers, or anything else, then it's not worth it to live that type of a life. And God didn't design life to work this way. He didn't design us to carry the entire weight of our destinies on our own. But yet I think a lot of times, a lot of us do that. We have our goals in front of us, and we know that we want to attain those goals, and we're going to do whatever it takes to get there. And if we have a few hiccups along the way, instead of waiting for God to come along and help us through those things, I know we have a tendency sometimes to just try to, just like a bull in a china closet, just push our way through them. And we kind of leave God back behind us, and then we wonder why it fails. We wonder why that it's so hard and so difficult to get where we want to be. When if we'd have just waited on God, his way to get to that point probably would have been a lot smoother. Might have taken longer, and it might not have been in our time frame or, like how our calendar was all laid out, but he has the right way that he wants us to get to that area and that part of our life. That's his job, and he's way better at it than we are. We like to think sometimes, I think, that we know who we are and we have control of our destinies and everything. But in all reality, most generally, God has the better idea when it comes to that. And that could be why sometimes we feel so burned out and stressed out all the time. And I can identify with that because I know that there's times in my past that I have gotten off on the wrong foot and started doing, taking a path that I shouldn't have. And all of a sudden, it seemed like it was 3 times as hard as what it was when I first started. And I was actually going the right direction that I should have been. And there's nothing worse than getting burned out. You start getting into the depressive states at that point. And, when that depression starts setting in and everything, it's hard for some people to come out of that. And so maybe when we look at this type of thing going on in our life, maybe we've been trying to control our world and we should relax a little bit and let God be God. Allow him to come in and direct us and sit back a little bit. We have a term on praise team. Haven't used it in a long time, but when I first started on praise team, it was used quite often. And we'd have certain songs on our list, and down below it, in the little comments, it would say "Fry the Frog." And for quite some time, I really didn't know what that meant. And I was too embarrassed to ask because everybody else knew what it meant. So I was trying to, oh yeah, I know what that means, but I really didn't. What that means is, if you guys familiar with how they cook frog legs? If you put a frog in hot water, in water and start it out cold, gradually warm it up, the frog will just sit there and die in it. And our term with praise team was start out slow and then build it up really fast and hard. So they call that fry the frog. But maybe that's what we need to do sometimes with our walk with God. Maybe we need to fry the frog. We need to step back a little bit and maybe slow ourselves down, get back into sync with Him and figure out what His plan is that He has for us and where He wants us to be. And then let Him provide the momentum. He's going to open those doors. If those doors are shut, we should never try to open them on our own. And a lot of times it's a lot harder to recognize open doors than it is closed doors. We know that. If we come up against a closed door, we're just going to come to a screeching halt. We probably see more closed doors a lot of times than we do open ones. But in our Christian walk, we need to be trying to figure out how to see those open doors and how to handle them when we do come upon them. But if those doors do close for whatever reason, we also need to make sure that we don't just try to force those doors open.
And God says too that He would prefer somebody to rather be hot or cold. The way you're talking, it kind of makes me think of lukewarm.
Mm-hmm.
Where you're kind of hemming and hawing. And He'd rather you be hot or cold. Obviously, He wants you to be hot, but He'd rather have somebody hot or cold than somebody lukewarm because He'll spit you out.
Yeah. He's going to get more purpose out of somebody that's hot. If you're cold, lukewarm, I almost kind of put those in the same category, really, because being lukewarm, you're going to be so wishy-washy that, I don't think God's going to get much out of you, even being a lukewarm person. Matter of fact, a lot of times those lukewarm people are the ones that come off as hypocrites that kind of set the stage for the rest of us Christians. We come up against these hard-nosed people that just want nothing to do with Christianity. Because they
standards of the Bible, but they make their life comfortable, but not those standards.
Yeah.
Make their life better.
Yeah. And the world's watching that.
That's mostly what the world watches.
Yeah. And when they see that we don't walk the walk that we talk, then they don't want no part of that, because at least they're smart enough to know that they don't want to be a Christian if that's what it means being a Christian is. It's frustrating that Christians don't see that part, that they still be a lukewarm person like that and kind of ride the fence. But it happens quite often. But when it comes down to, us being in that position where we try to control our own life, and we try to get to that point where we should let God be God, maybe we should kind of take a look at ourselves. We'll probably understand that maybe our prison cells are locked from the inside. If you really think about that and put that into context, it's crazy to think that we're locked in a specific situation in our life that we feel like we can't get out of. But yet, if you really look at things, a lot of times the reason we're locked in those places is because of choices we've made and because we won't seek God and what He wants us to do in order for us to get back out of that cell that we're in. We have complete control of opening up that prison cell. We have complete control of turning our life around and getting back where God wants us to be. So sometimes we get into these places where we feel burnout and we feel like that we're stressed and the depression might be setting in, or, the stuff may be going on in our life. Maybe we need to just kind of evaluate a little bit and see if maybe there's something that we've done that's caused us to be, stuffed up in a little hole, and God's waiting on us to move to get ourselves back out of it, because He's always there. So when Jacob first arrived at Laban's house, he had nothing. When he left, he was a very wealthy man. And in today's society, that seems weird, because we think that if we're a type of person that doesn't follow God's plan and doesn't follow His will, those are the people that we get mad at, that they're always blessed. The sinner out there that's getting blessed all the time and getting all it seems like anything they ask for, they get it. And we ask for stuff and we don't get nothing, it seems like. And, with that question comes up, well, why does this sinner person get blessed so much more than I do? Here I am a Christian and I'm following God and I'm doing what he's asking me to do. And he knows my needs. He knows I need this and I need that, all this worldly stuff that we go after, the materialistic things. But it's so easy to get frustrated in that type of situation. But with Jacob, when he came into Laban's house with nothing, he left a wealthy man. It didn't happen because he was clever. It happened because God decided to bless him. So regardless of how Jacob acted and the way that he came into the situation with Laban and what happened between Laban and him and the daughters and all that kind of thing, that was a mess. But God still chose to bless Jacob. And so when he came out of that, he was a very wealthy person. If you read the story in the Bible, you'll see that both Laban and Jacob recognized that Jacob's blessing came from God's hand. They both understood where it came from. Uncle and nephew spent years circling each other, stalking each other, maneuvering and manipulating, trying to outwit one another. But in the end, it wasn't Laban or Jacob who got the last laugh. It was God. God outplayed both of them. God has a way of doing what he wants. We have our strategies and plans. We think 4 steps ahead. We move our pawns, our bishops, our knights. We impress ourselves with our aptitude. Then God comes along right behind us and he says, checkmate. Jacob learned the hard way that sooner or later, the trickster gets tricked and the player gets played. Some people have been pretending, defending, deceiving for so long, they can't imagine letting God take control. They built their lives around the philosophy that the spoils go to the strongest, to the smartest, and the most manipulative. And I think I've seen this happen a lot of times. People in this situation. And, I think that I know with myself, when I got away from God and started doing my own thing, I, especially during that time frame that I was talking about earlier with my first marriage, I feel fortunate to be back where I'm at with God now, because there was a time back then when all that stuff was going on that when I sit there and I think about it, where I'm at this point from where I was at then, I'm pretty fortunate that I came back to where I'm at, because between me and her, we deceived and manipulated and done all that stuff so much that it kind of became a way of my life. And there's a point, I know within my own mind, I don't know if you guys have ever been in this situation or not before, but there's a point in my own mind where I did that so much that I was almost scared that when I finally gave my life back to Christ and tried to change the way I was living and tried to change my path and go the directions that I needed to be going, there was a little bit of doubt in there that I really changed. There was a little bit of doubt that I was really where I needed to be. Satan sat there and he played with that. And he messed with that in my mind. And it took me quite some time to get past all of that, because I would find myself between other people kind of trying to fall back to my own way sometimes, of the dishonesty and not being upfront and straight with people sometimes, because it had became such a second nature to me in that life that I led for about 8 years, that it almost became a defining moment in my life. It changed who I was. And I had to really work hard, which is crazy. With me growing up in church my whole life and going to Christian school and everything else, you'd think it'd be so simple to get your life straight and get back with God. But in all reality, it wasn't. It was very difficult for me. And, some of you guys may have experienced some of that yourself. I don't know. But it seemed like I had to work double time to try to get back where I needed to be, because that change that I made in my life kind of became second nature. And I think Satan, since I had already walked with God before, Satan obviously must have known what I was headed for in my future, that, God was going to call me to certain things and I was going to try to walk in that calling. I think he tried a little bit harder to keep me down for something. I don't know what was going on there, but there was a lot of times, when I wished that I could just change and quit messing up and quit doing the things that I shouldn't be doing. And it took God to change all that, to really just come in and for me to humble myself to him, and I finally had to come to a point where it's God, it's me and you. We're going to do this. And, once I got to that point, then God, instilled that side of me where I could keep moving forward at that point and put Satan behind me. Maybe at times in your life you wish that you could let your guard down, that you could enjoy each day instead of always fighting and striving for first place, but you think if you don't watch out for yourself, who will? Have you guys ever experienced that? Where if you didn't feel like you were taking care of number one, then who was going to do it? You guys ever been in that situation before? I know that, within my own situation, I still find sometimes, because I think because I'm a white personality, I have a tendency to do things on my own a lot. Yes, I'm married. Michelle's my spouse, and she's my number one, besides, right below God. And I do anything and everything with her, but I've had to really change my mind process because I could very easily walk through my whole life and take care of all my own problems, not talk to anybody about nothing, just work my way through stuff and leave everybody out in the dark and me just do what I got to do. And I've had to change that because she reads me like a book. And so if I don't include her in stuff that I'm going through, she can sense when I'm having issues or sense when I'm thinking, my thinking's going crazy or something, she kind of senses all of that. And if I don't include her and allow her, as a couple, allow us to help each other work through stuff like that and everything, that she feels like I'm pushing her out. She feels like I'm leaving her out at that point. And I think that comes back to how God feels with us sometimes. It's the same type of relationship. Because if we walk through life thinking that we can do all of this and we got this on our own, and we don't have to worry about anybody else and keeping anybody else involved, if we treat God that way, we're going to end up trying to solve our stuff on our own, leaving him out. We're going to fail. There's just not much way around that. God has that best plan for us, and he wants us to come to him. If we take a look at our third words, they might look something like this. We might say, I am strong. I am independent. I am alone. I am self-made. The thing about those words, though, is they aren't really true. They might feel true when we talk about this type of thing about ourselves, and we don't want to minimize, the contribution that we feel like that we're doing to our life or whatever. But ultimately, who is the true reason for our success? It's God. It's not really us. Now, if we are those things that we speak, if we are strong, independent, alone, self-made, or whatever, the only reason that we're that way is because God's involved. He is the person that's behind all of this. And when we look at this, God's blessing on our lives has far more to do with who he is than who we are. That was the whole point of the I am revelation when he was with Moses. When Moses asked him, who are you? And he's in the bush, and he kept being persistent with it and everything. Finally, God said, I am who I am. And what he meant about that, a manipulative outlook on life, is a result of not understanding the true source of our blessings. Our blessings come from God. They rest on our real selves. This gives us permission to lower our defenses. If you remember the passage in 2 Corinthians that we looked at here several chapters ago, that scripture, when I am weak, I am strong. In the context, Paul was pleading for God to set him free from his weakness, but God said no. Then God went on to explain his reasoning. Because, of course, Paul's sitting there, he can't figure that out. We all can't when we're in that situation. But God finally, he went on to explain the reason. In God, Paul's weakness was no longer weakness. It was strength at that point. It was the very place that God could accomplish the most. In the book here, Stephen writes, I'm convinced that God lets some of our weaknesses hang around because they offer us a window into our need for him. They remind us to turn to God constantly instead of trusting solely on ourselves. None of us controls our fate. We can influence it greatly. Our fate and our destiny in our life, we can influence that with decisions that we make and the paths that we take, but we don't control it. In the end, God still controls our fate, our future, and our eternity. And, that's one thing that even through the study, as we were going through those sections, it's something that's kind of made me think a little bit more into the way I lead my life every day. I get frustrated when I have my weak moments. And I get very upset when I have a plan set in front of me and I start pushing towards that plan and everything's going great. And then all of a sudden I have a bad moment and everything crashes on me and I don't understand why. And especially if it's something I've already been through before, and you would think that I already learned my lesson once before, but here I am going through it all over again. And, there's a lot of times I don't quite understand that. But after, going through and kind of being reminded of that story of Paul and whenever, God told him that when I'm weak, then I'm strong, I do realize now when I look back that a lot of those times when that stuff happened in my life, I did come out a stronger person in the end because I allowed myself to learn some lessons. And those are the moments, as we've talked before in several other discussions we've had, those are the times that we learn the most when we're in our valleys or we're having those come to Jesus moments with ourselves and we don't understand what's going on and why we're so discouraged and down the dumps and all this bad stuff's happening to us. If we can step back a little bit and look at it through God's eyes, we'll realize what's going on. And I think we learn a lot from that. Our sense of identity and value must take God into account. If we don't, we usually end up vacillating between delusions of grandeur and the depths of despair. One minute we're superheroes, the next minute we're waving a white flag. We are never so awesome that success is inevitable. We are never so terrible that success is impossible. Now, I like that statement because that basically tells us we cannot get into a bad enough state that we're hopeless. But at the same time, we can never get to the point either that we're so awesome that we're going to outdo our successes. There's limits on both sides of that. If we stay focused in that type of life, in that situation, and we don't allow the pride to come in either direction with that. In both our strengths and weaknesses, God makes the difference. Our successes come from His blessings. We can't take all the credit. We aren't smart enough or strong enough to achieve all that on our own. At the same time, our weaknesses are not insurmountable for Him. There is hope even in our failures and frailties because God's third word trumps ours every time. And I like how you put that because, a lot of times we have that third word for ourselves and we have that way that we look at ourselves, but God always one-ups us on that. And I know for myself, a lot of times I don't give myself credit. There's a lot of things that I don't think I'm really all that great at, but yet God helps me excel in some of those areas. I'm surprised a lot, even in my own self, a lot of times in the places that God's put me, because I never really within my own self really saw that in me. But through God and, trying to stay on that path that God's put me on, I have actually been able to move a lot further into where He wants me to be than I thought I would ever be. And I know looking back that there's no way that has anything to do with me. That's all God when it comes into that. So when it comes to being qualified, involving God in our identities and our endeavors is the heart of that, of being qualified, being valuable and approved and significant. When it came to that angel, when Jacob was wrestling with God and with that angel, the blessing came when Jacob owned up to his own identity, both the good and the bad. Once he owned up to who he truly was, and he admitted who he truly was, that's when he received that blessing. Sometimes we think that we have to be perfect to convince God to bless us, so we strive for holiness, which is the right thing to do, but we do it in order to convince God to bless us, which is wrong. That's a total wrong approach to try to manipulate God into. We don't have to convince God to bless us. He loves to bless us. And I think that's one thing that I've also come to learn. I think for many years, unfortunately, the way that I was taught and everything, it was almost like I had to earn His blessing. The way that I lived and the way that I carried myself, the way that I dressed, just all this stupid stuff that was, crammed down my throat. The only thing that I got out of that was, I've got to do all this stuff or God's not going to bless me with nothing. He's not going to use me. There's no way I'm ever going to be able to work in His kingdom and His field, all that kind of thing. Never once was I ever really told that God wants to do it, regardless of what I try to do to receive it. And in a way that frustrates me because I could have been a lot more advanced probably at a younger age than I was. if I would have just had an understanding that, hey, it's not because of all this stuff that you're doing that God's going to give you that blessing that he wants to put on your life. He already has the blessing right there. He's wanting to give it to you. He wants to put it upon you. It's up to us just to humble ourselves and accept that. And, walk in that path he wants us to be in, and he's going to do that. He wants to bless the real us. How, I think it was last couple weeks ago or whatever, we talked about the past Jacob, the future Jacob, and the frustrated Jacob. How the frustrated Jacob is the person here and now. That would be us. A lot of us are probably in a part of life where a lot of times we're just frustrated with things of who we are and that kind of thing. That's the person that God wants to bless, the real us. And that's who we are in our moment. And God took care of Jacob despite of his weaknesses, despite of his pretenses or his sinfulness. And Jacob had all of that. But God still blessed him anyway. Jacob spent his life like a cat burglar trying to pry open the windows of blessing with a crowbar. And meanwhile, God was inviting him to walk in the front doors as an honored guest. What's fascinating about Jacob's encounter with the angel, Jacob had always been a hill grabber. Jacob had always been the one who chased and grasped at others. Now God was grasping hold of him. The key to that whole story, you can spend your life clutching, clawing, and fighting, but what you really need is for God to grab you, for him to get a hold of you. And I think that once we can kind of get to that concept in our life, and we can understand that, it's not all about us chasing God. It's really about God chasing us down. And if we will quit running and we will actually stop for a moment and allow God to catch up with us and where we're at in our life, we will see a life change if we will just do that. That's what Jacob learned in this situation, because for all his life, up till the point that he wrestled that angel, he was constantly manipulating and conniving with people and trying to get successes in his own way and trying to force his own destiny, up to the point where he was trying to force God to give him blessings. I mean, he took it to the extreme. But once Jacob realized that God was chasing him down, and he humbled himself to that point, then he channeled all of that energy in a totally different direction at that point, and God blessed him, and he became a very wealthy person. So that wraps up this chapter here. The next chapter, we're going to be getting into comparison. It's a really good chapter. Anybody have any comments that you want to throw in or anything?
I think it's just kind of interesting and good reminder. Jacob thought that when he thought for all those years Esau just wanted to kill him for it all,
Mm-hmm.
And then once he finally saw Esau, Esau embraced him, whatever. And I think it's just a good reminder that we can run really hard and really fast away from God and try to live our own life, but once life kind of kicks us down enough times, we turn around and realize God's, right there behind us the whole time. It's just like there's no condemnation. It's just wanting to pick you up and turn you the other direction. But we just always think there's going to be like condemnation and I got to pay for all this. But that's already done. So I think it's just kind of a good reminder sometimes.
I think, did a lot of you grow up feeling condemnation all the time? Did you feel like that you just could never do nothing right?
I think it was because of the legalism, probably.
Yeah. And I think that I told several people, because, there's a lot of people in my life that know where I came from. And, I've told a lot of people that I feel like when I look back at those years of my life, I literally felt like I was in a prison. I was never able to do anything good enough to please anybody. The bar is set so high that you'll never attain it. And when you don't, you're constantly judged for it. And, I don't understand when you actually start digging into the Word and you see who God really is and how He really wants to operate in our life, it's actually pretty simple. There's not really a whole lot to it. All He asks for us is for us to, humble ourselves to Him and put our life in His hands, allow Him to lead and guide us, try to follow the path that He puts us on, and He's going to bless us for that. And He's going to use us. It's super simple. But a lot of times, a lot of Christians make it so difficult. They make it sound so hard to attain. any of those blessings. And, you know, I'm thankful for this story of Jacob and for a lot of reasons. But I think one of the main reasons I do really like this story is because it shows that we don't have to be perfect and be in all of that legalistic baloney and everything in order for God to bless us and use us. And, you know, Jacob became father of a nation. I mean, it's just unbelievable how God ended up the blessing that he gave him in the end. So anybody else have any final comments or anything?
I know as a pastor's kid too, sometimes it's not even the legalism side of it, it's everybody else has expectations for what you're supposed to be, how you're supposed to behave. You know, if you're the pastor's kid, you should know better. There's a lot of that, so sometimes people put their standards on you. Because like my mom and dad were probably no matter what, but other people have these higher standards for you.
Yeah. Well, for the longest time, I've always heard that pastors' kids were the worst.
Oh, thanks.
I don't know how many times I've heard that.
I mean, it is true, and you're,
Yeah.
you know, usually when you have the chance, because it happened to me, you know, that's usually the ones that tend to party the hardest and everything, because people have these expectations of you and you want to get away from them.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've been guilty myself of sitting in church and watching some of the pastors' kids run up and down the aisles and be noisy and all that stuff. And, you know, one of the first comments I think of is, they're the pastor's kids, they should know better than that, you know. That's just one of the first things that comes to our mind. But in all reality, nobody should have those expectations put upon them. We're all human.
They're children. They're gonna run around.
Yeah, and I'm sure our kids have been just as bad or worse, but because I'm not a pastor, they just got off a little easier. But we shouldn't categorize people like that. You know, God has grace for everybody. It doesn't matter whose coattail we're attached to. So, anything else? Feel good? Well, we'll go ahead and close up tonight and dismiss. Next week, we'll plan on going ahead and being here again on Thursday. Hopefully we'll get some more people starting to be able to come. I know Thursdays are kind of rough for schedules for a lot of people with work and everything, but thank you guys for coming. I hate to be sitting here by myself doing all this, so nice to have some company.
Especially having a lot of eyes staring at you.
Yeah, I know it. At least 20 of them, something like that.
Well,
So-
some of us are staring at you.
Yeah. All right, we'll go ahead and dismiss in prayer and get out here for tonight. Lord, we thank you for this evening. We thank you for this opportunity to dig into your word. God, I thank you for Jacob and this story that Jacob walked through. Lord, it just shows us that, you know, regardless of the mess that we make of ourselves or the mess that other people may try to make of us even, this world's pretty brutal sometimes. But God, it doesn't matter. You're still there chasing us down. Lord, you want to give us those blessings. And I just pray, Lord, that we would always be open to you and able to discern, Lord, the difference between the open and the closed doors. I pray, God, that we would always be able to understand that path that you want us on. And God, that regardless of what direction we may want to take in our life, Lord, that we would always have that wisdom from you to follow that path that you want us to be on. And Lord, that we could receive those blessings just as Jacob did on our life, Lord, so that we can spread the news to other people and try to win more people for your kingdom. God, I just pray tonight as we leave here that you bless each person that's here. I thank you, God, for those that have decided to come out tonight and to join me in here. And I just pray, God, you bring us back safely this next week. We just love you and thank you for all that you've done in your many blessings. In your wonderful name we pray.